Hi everyone and welcome. 208 years ago to the day the Heaton main colliery disaster occurred on Wednesday, May the 3rd, 1815, with the loss of the lives of 75 men and boys, some as young as 7 years old. I would like to tell their story as they should never be forgotten. I hope you will find this interesting and I thank you for watching. Although this disaster happened at the Heaton colliery, the majority of those who lost their lives were from Wallsend. I will include their names and ages at the end. In 1807, John Buddle Jr. became the head viewer at Heaton colliery, a job he held until 1821. As you may know, he was also the head viewer at the collieries in Wallsend at the same time. He had begun his life underground at the age of 6 when working with his father. He held the belief that going into the mines at a young age would help you to learn and be able to spot dangers easier in later life. I can understand his thoughts on this, but I still believe that colliery work was not and never should have been a job for children. But of course times were very different then, and what we would find unacceptable now was perfectly normal behaviour in the early 1800s. On the morning of May the 3rd, 1815, 101 men and boys were underground on the early shift, working with William Miller, the underviewer. About a mile from the engine pit, John Bell and Andrew Caldwell and the putter boy William McCoy. I understand a putter to be the person who transported coal tubs up and down the coal shafts. They were working in an exploratory drift beneath the old village of Heaton. A drift is an underground road between seams. Although the position of the abandoned workings of Heaton Banks colliery was known, there was no map of the old mine, so a series of borings would be ordered to determine the position of the flooded waste in order to retain a barrier to protect the new workings, and this had been going on at Heaton colliery for several months. At around 4:40 a.m. on the morning of May the 3rd, William Miller visited the men, who said that the water seemed to be leaking a little faster than usual, but Mr. Miller was not worried about this and told them to continue working. A short time after this, Mr. Miller met a man named Tim Dodgson, who asked him to return to the surface with him, but Mr. Miller wanted to stay underground as he had further work to do with the wastemen. This was a decision that would ultimately cost him his life. Around 15 minutes after that, the water leaking in got a little heavier, but this wasn't seen as a problem and the men continued with their work. However, when the coal was removed, the leak got much bigger. This time the men stopped work and sent the putter to warn the men at the cranes. After just a few minutes, John Bell decided to go back to see how things were, and it was at this point that the water broke in completely. The coal seam dipped to the east and the water was flowing down towards the shaft. This was the only escape route. Bell, Caldwell and McCoy all raced towards the shaft, followed by several other miners who were close by at the time. They were the lucky ones. Joseph Harrison was the last to reach the shaft and make his escape before the water sealed off the only escape route, leaving 75 men and boys and many pit ponies or horses trapped in the upper part of the mine. At the same time as the flood occurred, the Chance, Old Engine, Thistlebank, Nab and Venture pits of Old Heaton Banks colliery all fell in. This would probably have been caused by the rush of water weakening the sand below the soil. The Chance pit, nearest to the trapped men, seemed to be open nearly to the bottom. This would be the first location of the rescue attempts, but the shaft was not secure, so work had to be done to make it safe. This was not a quick fix. It took time, and sadly, at around 5 p.m, a large bed of sand broke away further down the shaft, and by 8 p.m, the opening was sealed off completely, and this ended all hope of entering the mine from this location. 3 large pumping engines were used in an attempt to draw out the water, but by the following day the water was actually higher than it had been the day before. The water was now apparently 183 feet up the engine pit shaft, and it was estimated that the water could rise to 240 feet before it would reach the part of the mine where the men were trapped and drown them. Many more attempts were made to reach the trapped men. John Buddle was actively involved in the rescue attempts, but despite efforts to enter from the old pits of Biker Colliery, none were successful. The old Moor pit was found and work began to try and gain entry from there, but the air was so bad that William Patterson, one of the rescuers, was very nearly suffocated. Again, the rescue attempts were held up. By the following Saturday, May the 13th, John Buddle was able to get down the Moor pit and advance 52 yards towards the trapped men. Again, this was a slow process, and a further 40 yards progress was made on the Sunday. Work continued all week, and the rescuers believed that they were about 97 yards away from being able to reach the trapped men. But on Saturday, May the 20th, a great discharge of foul air forced the men to abandon this rescue attempt. It was now almost 3 weeks since the disaster, and John Buddle realised that there was now no chance of the men being found alive. They had tried all ways that they could, but there was nothing left that they could do, and the rescue was called off, and all the remaining miners were transferred to Wallsend colliery. I don't think that any of us can truly imagine how the relatives of those trapped would be feeling, knowing that their loved ones were hundreds of feet underground with no way of escaping, and they had to face the fact that none of them would make it out alive. On top of this, knowing that their bodies might not be recovered for many more months to come. Men and boys just working to keep their families with a roof over their heads and food on their tables, lost in the blink of an eye. Work did continue, but now it was simply to try and save the pit from being completely destroyed. The water level did slowly start to fall, and by October of 1815, John Buddle was able to go down into parts of the pit. Water levels were still high, so access was very limited. In January of 1816, the water was much lower. 2 horses, or pit ponies, were found. Both were said to be nothing more than skeletons. On the 6th of January 1816, some 8 months after the flooding disaster, the first body was found. It was that of William Scott. This may also have been William Stott. He was 79 years old, and he was buried at Wallsend in St. Peter's churchyard on the 7th of January 1816. Slowly the rest of the bodies were discovered. The next was William Miller, then came Robert Richardson, Henry Dixon and Arthur Dixon, who were found on the 23rd of January 1816. At times the access routes were blocked and work had to be done to clear the way, and this took until February. And on the 14th, Richard Heppel and Robert Smith discovered 55 bodies at an area known as Gibson's Crane. It seems they had been alive for some time and had attempted to eat one of the horses trapped with them. However, they felt that the men trapped here had died of suffocation, not starvation, even believing that their rescue attempt in 1815 had created the foul air that had passed into this area and ended their lives. It can't be imagined how they must have felt, knowing that they had done the exact opposite of what they had hoped to achieve when they were trying to rescue the trapped miners. The following Tuesday and Wednesday, 51 bodies were buried in the southeast corner of St. Peter's churchyard in Wallsend. The photo you can see on screen at the moment shows roughly the area where the mass grave would be located. Unlike the later 1835 Wallsend disaster, there are no details of the funerals, and it would seem unlikely, given the length of time that the bodies had been missing for, that they would have been kept at home, but it is possible, as this was very much the custom at the time. The delay between finding the bodies and the funerals would no doubt have been to give time for the mass grave to be dug. It is also not known what happened to the families of the men who were lost, if they were still in the area or had moved on to other locations. I was unable to find any details, but if anyone knows, please do let me know. There is a plaque in the church porch of St. Peter's which tells of the disaster and that those who perished are buried in the churchyard. Some of the miners were buried also at Long Benton. It would not be until around March the 9th of 1816 before the final bodies would be found and the final funerals would take place. Ultimately, one of the saddest things that I read was that the relatives of the victims had to go down into the mine to identify their family members, having been lost for so long they were not able to tell without help who was who. Imagine having to do this, travelling into the very area that had taken your loved ones from you, and knowing that they would no longer look like those who had left for work the year before. Elizabeth Thew was one such widow who had to perform this task. On spotting one of her sons, she found his tin candle box in one of his pockets. On it was inscribed his last message. I have included my copies of the drawings of this message and also the one from my husband, but they were very hard to read, so the words you can see are as follows. Fret not, dear mother, for we are singing while we had time and praising God. Mother, follow God more than I ever did. On the other side of the tin, the message was, if Johnny is saved, be a good lad to God and thy mother. After the disaster, an appeal was launched to raise funds to support the widows and orphans. The public, as always, gave generously, but the funds would only be a temporary measure. What happened to them after the money ran out is unknown. The colliery would reopen for work that same year and would continue to be worked until around 1852 when it closed for good. The names and ages of those who lost their lives in May of 1815 are as follows. Please do understand some names may have been recorded incorrectly, but I am using the details from the Durham Mining Museum website. The youngest being 7 years old, the oldest 82. Burial locations, if known, will also be included. The price of coal was indeed a heavy price to pay. John Bainbridge, aged 42, buried Wallsend. Andrew Bryson, aged 40, buried Wallsend. Robert Campbell, aged 31, buried Wallsend. Jacob Curtis, aged 15, buried Wallsend. George Dawson, aged 36, buried Wallsend. Arthur Dixon Jr., aged 26, buried Wallsend. Arthur Dixon Sr., aged 64, buried Wallsend. Henry Dixon, aged 40, buried Wallsend. William Dixon, aged 21, buried Wallsend. James Dodd Jr., aged 16, buried Wallsend. James Dodd Sr., aged 40, buried Wallsend. Simon Dodd, aged 36, buried Wallsend. Thomas Dodd, aged 7, buried Wallsend. William Elliot, aged 7, buried Wallsend. Robert English, aged 36, buried Wallsend. John Fromm, aged 21, buried Wallsend. Charles Gardner, aged 20, buried Wallsend. James Gardner, aged 24, buried Wallsend. Thomas Gardner, aged 17, buried Wallsend. William Gardner, aged 15, buried Wallsend. Edward Gibson, aged 20, buried Long Benton. Edward Gibson, aged 82, buried Wallsend. John Gibson, aged 31, buried Wallsend. Matthew Gibson, aged 22, location of burial unknown. Nicholas Gibson, aged 18, location of burial unknown. Richard Gibson, aged 45, buried Wallsend. John Gordon, aged 19, buried Wallsend. Thomas Gordon, aged 15, buried Wallsend. William Graham Jr., aged 7, buried Wallsend. Christopher Gray, aged 14, buried Wallsend. Thomas Gray, aged 12, buried Wallsend. William Green, buried Wallsend, age unknown. Ralph Hall, aged 15, buried Wallsend. William Hall, aged 21, buried Wallsend. Matthew Johnson, aged 28, buried Wallsend. William King, aged 16, buried Wallsend. George Laws, aged 50, buried Wallsend. Thomas Lumsden, aged 18, buried Wallsend. William Miller, aged 46, buried Wallsend. Nicholas Miller, aged 15, buried Wallsend. Thomas Miller, aged 16, buried Wallsend. Shipley Mitchison, aged 42, burial location unknown. John Newhill, aged 37, buried Wallsend. Lancelot Nicholson, aged 29, buried Wallsend. John Pratt, aged 10, buried Wallsend. John Ray, aged 26, buried Wallsend. John Redhead, aged 22, buried Wallsend. John Rennick, aged 25, buried Wallsend. William Rennick, aged 23, buried Wallsend. Robert Richardson, aged 64, buried Wallsend. John Robertson, age unknown, buried Wallsend. Edward Robson, aged 34, buried Wallsend. William Scott, aged 21, buried Wallsend. William Cooper Scott, this may also be William Cooper Stott, aged 79, buried Wallsend on the 7th of January 1816, the first body recovered. Anthony Southern, aged 18, buried Wallsend. Robert Southern, aged 14, buried Wallsend. William Southern, aged 25, buried Wallsend. George Steele, aged 25, buried Wallsend. Robert Steele, aged 25, buried Wallsend. Walter Stokoe Jr., aged 17, buried Wallsend. Walter Stokoe Sr., aged 42, buried Wallsend. George Thew, aged 19, buried Wallsend. John Thew, aged 50, buried Wallsend. William Thew, aged 19, buried Wallsend. Thomas Thompson, aged 16, buried Wallsend. William Thompson, aged 21, buried Wallsend. Thomas Todd, aged 7, buried Wallsend. David Unwin, aged 48, buried Wallsend. John Watson, aged 20, buried Wallsend. John Watson, aged 12, buried Wallsend. Thomas Watson, aged 10, buried Wallsend. Henry Widrington, aged 20, burial location unknown. Ralph Widrington Jr., aged 28, burial location unknown. Ralph Widrington Sr., aged 56, burial location unknown. Michael Wilson, aged 15, buried Wallsend.